Good afternoon, Hartford. This is the one of the latest session of Voices of Veterans that are being put on for you by several veterans. Myself, Dave Yano, a Vietnam veteran who's a Hartford resident, and Steve Fournier, a Vietnam veteran who served in Germany during the Vietnam War in intelligence in the Air Force. And with the support and the help of Hartford Public Access Television, and because we are Hartford residents, we have been allowed to use their equipment, to work on their equipment and train with their equipment and produce and put together a show that is about veterans, for veterans, and done by veterans. And that's exactly what our purpose was. It's a half hour of exposure in which I myself, as a retired librarian from Hartford Public Library, the city of Hartford, bring books written by veterans. I've also had several veterans on and as participants in the program, and we hope to have more veterans on. We've had an Afghan veteran who was a former Marine who's been on the show. We had another Vietnam veteran, Bill Potvin, who's been on the show, and I'm reaching out to veterans in the area, and they are welcome, no matter what your political views, to come on the show and express yourselves. And the main thrust of the show is to give some kind of format for veterans to speak about what war has done to them and to their families and to their country. And today is a significant day, April 30th. On this day, April 29th and April 30th in 1975, was the fall of Saigon and the so-called end of the war in Vietnam, though actually Vietnam goes on and on and on. It never really ends because we've carried that war home with us. But all of us who are Vietnam veterans and our parents and other people who were alive during that time period watched in utter dismay as helicopter after helicopter was pushed off the decks of carriers as they were flying out Vietnamese and also some of our soldiers who were still in country from all kinds of areas in Vietnam. Over 6,000 people were evacuated from Vietnam during the fall of Saigon in 1975. And we watched as helicopter after helicopter was pushed off the decks of the carriers into the South China Sea or landed next to ships in the South China Sea as people bailed out into the ocean and then were picked up by Navy corpsmen and Navy people who were there to rescue people. This particular action was not the end of our involvement in wars across the world. And we should take this as a lesson on what happened. And so today, I'm going to read from a book written by Philip D. Bidler, who was a platoon leader and an officer in the 11th Cavalry in Vietnam in 1969 to 1970, virtually almost the same year that I was there. I was there from 70 to 71. And he recounts in this book, it's called Late Thoughts on an Old War. He is now an English professor. He is a professor of English at the University of Alabama and has written or edited more than 10 books. He served as an armored cavalry platoon leader in Vietnam. And this book, I'm going to talk, is a chapter in this book entitled Solatium. More than 30 years later, and not a week goes by when I don't think of the dead Vietnamese boy at Gia Ray. Actually, I go through periods when I see him every day. I zip open the body bag and out he comes, face first, the rest of him in the fetal crouch, arms and legs drawn up in front like some dreadful insect mutation. Later I find out that is what dead bodies often do. Everything, head, limbs, torso, is covered in a kind of viscous, translucent slime, the stuff used in monster movies. A combination of mucus, chest fluid, urine, and dissolved fecal matter. And it smells oddly sweet. Later I find out that is how dead bodies often smell. It's dusk. Earlier in the day, I've sent this boy out on a helicopter with a depressed skull fracture. The mechanized unit to which I was a platoon leader, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and assorted other vehicles had been moving through the village, and a big tank retriever had knocked down the corner of an old ceremonial stone gate. A heavy piece, about the size and weight of a cinder block, had fallen on the boy's head, caving in one side of his skull. When I pick him up and carry him to my track, I notice that the indentation is in the exact shape of the block. My next recollection has me inside a nearby firebase, Marianne I think it's called, kneeling on the helipad with the boy in my lap and a Prick 25 radio beside me. I'm yelling into the handset, begging for an Army medevac helicopter, a dust-off. Voices on the other end keep telling me that no dust-off is available, and that even if one is, I can't call a dust-off for a Vietnamese civilian. In between sessions of screaming at the bastards on the radio, I keep looking down at the kid, putting him and patting him and stroking him, telling him it's going to be all right. We'll get him out of there, and somebody will take care of him. He seems to be just barely breathing. Under his short, black, shiny hair, I can see the big rectangular dent in the side of his skull. As I remember, it's finally the brigade executive officer, a colonel, who with much impatience finally agrees to land his command ship and take the boy to the Vietnamese Army compound at Xuan Loc, about 10 miles away, where the Vietnamese have their own medical evacuation unit. When the helicopter lands, I give him over to one of the door gunners, and I go back to my platoon. In the years since, I have tried every way I can to put together the rest of that day, but it just doesn't exist. We may have patrolled the jungle with tanks and armored personnel carriers like we did most days, or set up blocking positions for the infantry sweeping the other way. We may have done convoy escort or roadblock duty. It was bad country up there. On the roads, we kept passing burned-out hulks from the last American unit to operate in the place a year or so before, a hot-shit armored cavalry regiment commanded at the time by George Patton, Jr., that obviously had not won all that many hearts and minds. Once in the middle of a jungle clearing, we found some kind of aircraft fuselage with French markings. But I remember thinking, is this going to be a long war? Whatever happened that day in late July or early August 1969, my platoon was back inside the firebase by late afternoon, setting up for night perimeter security. The boy was waiting for us when we pulled in. Also waiting were orders to get him cleaned up and ready for a ceremony in the morning when he would be returned to his family for burial. Because I had the only field medic, he got the job. I went with him to see if I could help. As platoon officer, I knew there would be times when I would never ask anyone to do something I wouldn't do. I decided this was one of those times. That was when I opened up the body bag. It was also when my medic went temporarily insane. He was a decent man and a brave soldier, the kind of medic everybody called Doc. And he had been through a lot. He took what he saw as an insult to the dead. He screamed, he raged, he wept, he cursed every curse he could think of, mainly at the fucking Arvins. It seemed to be a professional matter. Who would let something like that happen to a kid and then not clean him up? After a while, the thing seemed to pass. He settled down and went to work, wiping the boy's body and straightening his limbs. I offered to stay and help, or at least keep him company. He told me in a kindly voice that he wanted to do it by himself and that I should go back to the platoon. A solatium is a payment made to a family who suffered an injury or a death caused by United States Armed Forces. You know how much they paid for this dead boy? $35. That was the going price for a dead Vietnamese child who had been killed by one of our units. I'm 58 now and a parent for the first time. My wife and I have a daughter who is 9. I have an obsessive fear that something bad is going to happen to her. There are times when I put her in the car to go somewhere with her mother or someone else I really trust, and I worry that I'm never going to see her again. One weekend about 3 years ago, when my wife and I were at the beach, my daughter was staying with her aunt. I convinced myself that they were both going to be freakishly murdered. For a day and a half I sat in a chair staring and mute, bludgeoned with medication. My wife took me home. A VA psychologist who has become a friend of mine tells me that is all is typical of what he calls recurrent unpleasant thoughts, a form of PTSD called delayed post-traumatic stress disorder. It's all through the literature, he tells me. Deep down somewhere, he says, it's the dead Vietnamese boy of Gia Ray I'm thinking about. And he's right, I've decided. I've also checked the DSM-4, and he's right there too. It's all in black and white. Intrusive memories, persistent anxiety, excessive vigilance. Oddly, as many Vietnamese as we killed in what were called accidents of war, you don't see much written about solatium in literature. Depending on the brief reference appears in a glossary, words of the Vietnam War as a grievance payment, under which are listed not only solatium but also compensation payment and go-min money. Solatium procedures, it says, involve cash payments ranging from a few dollars to several $100s made to Vietnamese as compensation for property damages to buildings, crops, farm animals, and personal possessions, and also for grief suffered as a result of the loss of a loved one. However, as with virtually everything involving money among the Americans and Vietnamese, it goes on to explain a built-in potential for shamming and scamming quickly became a two-way street. Most of the time in Vietnam, even if something looked like a real word, chances were it was trying to say anything but what it meant, such as pacification was forced resettlement, revolutionary development was political indoctrination, Phoenix was political assassination, forward together meant Americans fight and Arvin's watch. For years I tucked solatium away as if trying not to disturb it. On the one hand, it seemed a kind of beacon in the general middle. On the other, I was almost afraid to find out what kind of linguistic freak show it would turn out to be. Eventually, I looked it up and found that my intuitions were on both counts had been dreadfully correct. The good news was that it did have a direct connection with solace. Indeed, by some accounts, the word solace itself actually derived directly from solatium as a past participle form of solari, to comfort or to console. The bad news was that I found the word only in obscure legal lexicons, conceptually a bizarre inheritance of English law from Scottish law, which in turn became, because early Scottish lawyers did most of their study on the continent, derived from Roman law by way of the medieval church. Solatium, compensation, especially damages allowed for hurt feelings or grief, or distinguished from damages for physical injury. I think that when the Army came up with the word solatium, it set some very strange magic loose in the world. For me, it will always be a reminder, even amid the latest revelations of the sheer amplitude and discrimination of our killing and destructiveness in Vietnam, of something every bit as horrifying, and that is of how totally, appallingly, even insanely resolute we remained in believing in our good intentions. Solatium. What's in a word, I ask, when now as then there's still so little solace for anyone, American or Vietnamese, who had anything to do with that war. As an American still trying to come to terms with what we did there, I hang on to it for two very specific reasons. It won't bring that boy back, and it won't make him go away either. That's just one chapter in a very good book called Late Thoughts on an Old War. And as a former medic myself, I've often thought of how we could bring some kind of conclusion to the war that we fought. And I'm of the opinion that there will be no conclusion until the day that I am gone, for me at least. And as long as we teach about this war and we talk about this war, I think it's incumbent on us to make sure the voices of veterans are heard about what this war did to us and what it did to the Vietnamese. So put that word in your dictionary, all right, solatium, and make sure you keep it there and look it up once in a while, because as Philip Beadler said, he always thinks about that boy in one way or another, and it never goes away. The next issue I'm going to talk about has to do with a book that's written not by a veteran, but one that certainly has a lot to do with veterans. It's by Don Winslow, and it's called The Border. And what I found amazing about this book, I first heard about this book when I read an editorial by George F. Will. George F. Will wrote this editorial for the New York Times. It's called The Horrifying Futility of the War on Drugs. On February 12th, Joaquin Guzman Lora, a.k.a. El Chapo, was convicted of multiple crimes of running the Sinaloa drug cartel, Mexico's largest. 13 days before his conviction, authorities seized enough of the synthetic opioid called fentanyl for 100 million lethal doses. It was hidden in a truck carrying cucumbers through the Nogales port of legal entry. On February 28th, authorities at the port of Newark inspecting a container ship that had arrived from Colombia found inside a container supposedly filled with dried fruit 3,200 pounds of cocaine, worth $77 million on U.S. streets. This was 2 days after Don Winslow published The Border, the final volume in his 19-age trilogy of novels, The Power of the Dog and the Cartel, about the cartels and the U.S. war on drugs. He could hardly have arranged a better launch for his book, which is already on the bestseller lists. His thesis is that the war on drugs resembles the Vietnam War in its futility and its collateral damage to Mexicans, more than 250,000 of whom have died, and another 40,000 have disappeared, according to the Financial Times. In the past dozen years, from violence associated with rivalrous cartels and law enforcement measures, those endless photos of confiscated sacks of drugs do resemble old photos of dead Viet Cong, body counts of replaceable bodies. El Chapo, 61, will die in a U.S. Supermax prison, and his incarceration, he has been in custody since 2016, will make no difference regarding drug flows. The mayhem and sadism Winslow describes are, he says, derived from credible reports. Wonder what the Central Americans who trekked through Mexico to the U.S. border are fleeing? Read Winslow's description of a 10-year-old Guatemalan living off a garbage dump, alert for trucks bringing garbage from the better neighborhoods. Winslow might be right about the sinister involvements of some U.S. financial institutions in handling the cartel's millions. He could, however, have omitted the very thinly disguised President Trump and his son-in-law, who knowingly uses cartel money to rescue himself from a bad Manhattan real estate deal. One reason to read fiction is to avoid reading about those people. However, the upward of $40 billion in profits made from the $150 billion U.S. market, 30 million consumers of illicit drugs must go somewhere. First to Mexico. So much cash, Winslow says, they don't even count it, they weigh it. But then where does it go? Every day, 4,500 trucks pass, necessarily with usually minimal inspection, through 3 legal entry points along the U.S.-Mexico border. Any wall would be irrelevant to interrupting drug shipments, as is the strategy of bringing down cartel kingpins. The New York Times reports that in 2016 and 2017, when El Chapo was already in custody, Mexican heroin production increased by 37%, and seizures of fentanyl in places like Nogales more than doubled. The supply-side attack on drugs is frustrated by, among other things, geography and the torrent of south-north commerce. The demand side is frustrated by declining prices, the supply-side failure for increasingly potent products such as fentanyl, which has passed prescription opioids and heroin, which has surpassed prescription opioids and heroin in overdose deaths. Made from chemicals, not crops, and patented almost 60 years ago. It is mixed with heroin for an extra kick, and if doses are not carefully calibrated, a lethal kick. Says New York University Mark A. Klayman, in 1979, a milligram of pure heroin sold for about $9 in today's prices. Today, it costs less than 25 cents. 50 grams of fentanyl, just over an ounce and a half, has the punch of a kilogram of heroin, and it's way, way cheaper. 300 micrograms, roughly the weight of a grain of table salt, can kill, and dealers are not precise chemists. We have, Kleiman says, about 30 times as many drug dealers behind bars today as we had in 1980, but today's dealers employ cell phones, texting, social media, and home delivery. In the most recent global drug survey, Klayman says cocaine users around the world reported that the most recent cocaine order was delivered in less time on average than their most recent pizza order. He notes that serious cultural change has taken 50 years regarding tobacco, yet it is still much more widely used than any of the illicit drugs except for cannabis. And the fentanyls aren't going to be the last class of purely synthetic and super potent recreational chemicals. They're just the first. Worse, living through chemistry, even if it disadvantages the crop-growing cartels of Winslow's ethic. I think that it's necessary for the American people to take a hard look at what the border is actually causing. The wall that President Trump wants to build is not going to solve the heroin addiction problem. And the fact that most of the heroin is grown in Afghanistan now, and that veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq have come home addicted to heroin, mimics exactly what happened in 1970 to 1975 when Vietnam veterans were coming home from Vietnam addicted to number 4 heroin, which was 90% pure, and come back and hitting the streets with their addiction with no help from the VA and no help from the people around them, except for their immediate families who are trying to save their lives. I think we have to learn the lesson. We have failed to learn the lesson of what happened in Vietnam, and that's why it's replicating itself right now. I think that people need to read this book, The Border, and to see what is actually happening and to open their eyes before it's too late and they're closed for good. It is necessary that we pay attention to what happened to Vietnam veterans in Vietnam and how it's replicated today in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this flood of fentanyl and heroin is coming through the ports of entry, not the wall that doesn't exist. If you have a chance, pick up Don Winslow's The Border and read what's really happening at the border and what's really going on with the heroin market. And find out where all that money is going. It's invested somewhere, most of it in Wall Street.